everyone. Welcome back to the Underwater Photography Show. As always, I am Matthew Sullivan.
And I'm Alex Mustard.
And a question that I'm sure Alex gets asked way more than me, but that I get asked quite a bit too, is specifically about how to shoot split levels and avoid streaking or droplets. So we figured we'd do an episode just going over some basics on split level shooting and also specifically addressing that question. So Alex, how do you avoid droplets on split level images?
Well, I'm not going to answer that straight away because I don't think droplets are the reason that most split level images don't work out for people. I think that perhaps the biggest challenge people make when shooting split levels is they shoot split levels that don't need to be split levels. And I think for good quality, engaging split level images, you need subject matter that is both interesting above and below the surface. And I think a lot of underwater photographers, the moment they have anything near the surface, immediately think split level, when perhaps a reflection shot, a Snell's window shot, or a fully underwater shot, not even really using much of the surface, all of those things, just with some surface texture or something, all of those things might be a better choice than a split level. So I think the first thing to, part of successful split level photography is to choose your split levels carefully, where you have quality subject matter both above and below the surface. And a very simple example of that is, for example, I'm going to the Red Sea in a few weeks' time. There, the coral grows right up to the surface in loads of places. And you have lovely, lovely coral reefs right below the surface of the ocean. And it can be very tempting to think, oh, wow, I've got shallow coral, I should do a split level. But the Red Sea, most of the time, there are no clouds in the sky. So if you do a split level there during the daytime, you end up with just a blue above surface. And it's actually a very boring shot. You have a beautiful coral reef, a nice surface, and then just someone's painted blue, solid blue above it. So in the Red Sea for split levels, we predominantly shoot split levels there around sunset, when suddenly that blue sky is much more interesting with a sunburst maybe near the horizon, strong colors in the sky from the sunset, and it becomes a much more interesting picture. And I think that's kind of what I'm saying is both parts have to be at their best for it to be a powerful split level image. You're looking for subject matter that works in both halves. The other thing is that if you are choosing to split an image into an above and below water part, you want both of those parts really working for the viewer. And that means in 95% of cases, you want both parts to be sharp. And it's easy to shoot a split level photo. It's easy to hold a camera half in, half out the water and take a picture. It's difficult to take a split level photo and get both halves in focus. In order to get both halves in focus, you need to use the correct technique. And if you use the wrong technique, you'll end up with only half of it in focus. And sometimes that can work, but it's because you probably didn't do the technique right. And if you do the technique right, you can always have both halves in focus. The key to the technique, without going on and on about it, because we're supposed to be talking about droplets more than anything, is to focus underwater and then use depth of field to get the above water part sharp. So you focus under the water and you shut your aperture down in order to have the above water part sharp. If you focus on the subject matter above the surface, your underwater subject will almost always be out of focus. It ends up optically too close to the camera and it's out of focus. Whereas if you focus on that underwater part, the depth of field extends far enough to hold the above water part in focus, because depth of field extends further behind a subject than in front of a subject. So you always want to focus on the closest thing that you want in focus in a picture. And then you need to close that aperture down in order to get enough depth of field. And it does vary a little bit between different sensor sizes and different dome port sizes, but you usually need to be f16, f18, f20 area on most camera systems in order to get that above water section reasonably, nice and in focus and in sharp. So that then causes another problem with that. Shooting pictures at f18, f20 means you get quite low on light. So the next thing you want to do is to boost your ISO a little bit higher than you would for normal shooting, so that you've got that extra bit of ISO to help you have a reasonable shutter speed to shoot above and below the surface. I have to say the majority of split level photos, because the subject matter is near the surface, they really don't need flash. And I think a lot of photographers make shooting split level photos much harder for themselves by thinking they need flash, because as underwater photographers, we're always shooting with flash. So it's underwater, we use flash. And I think it's important to remember that when you're shallow, you don't need flash. And then the final part you have to sort of think about technique wise is focus. And I said you have to focus underwater, but I think split level photography is much easier when you use a fixed focus. If that focus is fixed on the underwater subject, either by setting your focus to back button or focusing once and turning the autofocus manual focus control to manual focus so it stays fixed on the underwater part, that will make your shooting a lot easier. And then you can just concentrate on timing the shot to be at exactly the right moment with the water surface. In terms of gear, the more floaty your camera, the easier it is to shoot split levels. Now, if you're walking in off a beach or you're dangling the camera off the side of the boat, it doesn't really matter if the camera is floaty or not. You've got a stable surface in which to hold the camera upright. But if you're swimming over delicate corals or you're in maybe deeper water or something like that, it's much harder to hold this camera right at the surface. So if you're able to add some buoyancy to it beforehand, that will make the camera float much more easily. And a big acrylic dome port makes shooting splits much easier than a small glass dome port, which is heavy. Big dome ports also make it easier to control the surface meniscus, and they also help you actually keep both parts more in focus, just because, without getting too technical, the underwater subject with a big dome port isn't as close to the camera optically as with a small dome port. Once that dome port is in water, because it's the way a dome port works. So big dome ports, focus underwater, fix the focus, shut the aperture down, boost the ISO, and you're on to a pretty good winning formula. So that's kind of, for me, the basics of stuff. I'm sure I've forgotten something. I don't know if there's anything you want to fill in there, Matt.
Not off the top of my head just yet. I think you covered a lot of it. One thing I wanted to ask, I was curious, is you said adding buoyancy to the housing. What do you use to do for that?
So I usually usually I'm working in the field, away from home. So I don't have access to every piece of underwater photography piece of equipment I have. I usually like to use those, I call them Popeye, after Popeye the Sailor Man arms, for the thing, which are the big chunky arms, and the ones that are about that sort of size, so kind of a double section of big fat arm. They're quite useful to have on trips for buoyancy. I use them sometimes with the MWL as well, and those can be really good on the housing. Now, if you're going to hold your housing the normal way up, you don't want the buoyancy for split levels attached to the top of the housing, because most of it's going to be out of the water. So you either want a way to attach your buoyancy to the base of your housing, and if you've got some spare screw-in mounts that fit into the mounting holes in the bottom of the housing, that's great. If you haven't got that, just use a straight section of strobe arm to begin with, tightened really tightly on the clamps from the top of the housing, and then put the buoyancy elements below that, so that the buoyancy is all below the housing, the water line, so it's pushing the housing up.
Yeah.
You don't have to use expensive strobe arms for that. Anything full of air will work really well. So actually, children's, we call them in England armbands. I can't remember what they're called in the States.
I know what you're talking about, like little inflatable floaty things.
Yeah. Those are really useful because they're really cheap. They're really widely available everywhere, and you can put those around your strobe arms, inflate them, and have lots of buoyancy. When we're on the liverboards, we often ask if the liverboard has got any old life jackets, because the life jackets that they, always say are under your seat or on a liverboard, in the cabins or something like that, or any boat's always got life jackets. Sometimes the operator will have some old life jackets lying around in a storage shed or something like that. And if you remember to ask before you leave port, they can often find you some old life jackets and things, which are really useful for holding the cameras up. You can also use an SMB, safety sausage, that sort of thing, trap air in that and hold that, use the housing up. And you also, if you're having to swim and shoot split levels, the more buoyant you are, the better as well. Because if you're stuck on the surface, it makes it easier to lift the housing up. There are also places where you might be able to put your feet down, but you don't want to, because if you put a pair of fins down, they're going to stir up a load of sediment. And so what I do in that situation is I'll wear a weight belt, but I won't put any weights on it. And when I've swum to the area I want to take a split level, I will take my fins off my feet and I will push them down my back into my weight belt and basically strap them to myself in the water. I'm now obviously not able to swim as fast as normal, but that's not too important for split level photography. And I'll swim slowly into position without fins on, which does take a long time, but I'm obviously already there. And then with my bare feet, I can stand without stirring up sediment. And if it's, say, like a coral lagoon environment, there's often like coral heads and sand in between. And if you've got fins on, it can be very hard to find a space that's big enough for you to put your fins down. But it's very easy if you've got bare feet just to be able to, just to be able to step into those gaps. And that can make it a lot easier to shoot split levels. So I very often wear like an empty weight belt just simply as a fin storage device. Because if you take your fins off, even if they float, they're really hard to find. And as soon as they've floated like 20 feet away from you, that's a really hard swim, but you've got a housing in your hands and you haven't got fins on, because you can't do like breaststroke or anything when you've got a housing in your hands. And yeah, you don't go very fast when you've got to drag a housing through the water. So you don't want to leave your fins floating. You definitely want to tuck them into yourself.
One other thing about that too is if you leave your fins on, and I'm sure every landscape photographer knows this too, because tripod legs sneak into the bottom of frames. It's going to be a lot harder to keep your fins out of the frame and keep your feet still, especially if you're shooting super wide lenses if you have your fins on, because chances are you're going to end up with your fin tips in the frame, or you're going to be standing like a penguin with your feet out to the side, which probably isn't all that comfy and will still stir stuff up. And one other thing in terms of like DIY float material you can use is I had a friend one time who had a really heavy video rig, and he got heavy duty empty plastic bottles, like plastic water bottles, and just strapped those to his rig, and he was using it underwater as well. So he would sort of flood them sometimes to control the buoyancy. But if you have just air in them, you can leave that floating at the surface. And that's a very cheap way to get some nice buoyancy for splits.
And it's, ultimately those solutions will make the shooting so much more comfortable and so much more productive. I think all those factors stay on your side. So I think we should finish by tackling the question that kind of everyone's always asking, is how to avoid the droplets. And my facetious answer to that is to say, to begin with, if you don't get your dome port wet, you don't have to worry about droplets. And people go, oh yeah, but the reality is if you're going in specifically to shoot split levels and you get that buoyancy on the housing, actually the top of the dome port doesn't get very wet. And, if you're going in off a beach or in a river to shoot split levels, again, your housing doesn't have to get wet. So in a lot of an swimming pool or wherever you're shooting splits, so in a lot of split level shooting situations, there's no need to worry about droplets, because the only reason your dome port got wet is you're used to being handed your housing down from a boat and you immediately put it underwater. Whereas actually, if you're going to shoot split levels, you put it on your shoulder and you swim with the housing balanced on your shoulder as you swim across to the place you're going to shoot split levels. And if you've got a wetsuit on, haven't got a weight belt on, you're very buoyant. So those things can, really can make a big difference. Though, if I'm going in the water and I know that I'm not in a situation where I can keep the dome port dry, then I like to put some sort of coating onto the dome port, which helps with the droplets. And there's lots of things around that can do that. I think anything that creates a film works pretty well. So things that I've commonly used is I'll use saliva, because it's readily available. On the liveaboards, we quite often ask for potatoes, because the starch definitely in the potatoes definitely helps. So you get a slice of potato from the kitchen, you squeeze it till it's getting juice out, you rub that juice on the dome port, you let it dry, not till it's baked on, but dry till it's just dried out, and then you're ready to go in the water. And obviously you wash off all the bits and everything before the first photo, and that creates a nice film. And then if you are getting droplets, what you do is you dip the dome port, bring it up, hold it steady for just about half a second, let the meniscus calm down, and before it starts beading into to beads and droplets, you shoot. And that works very nicely if you're in a situation where you can't keep it dry. Things that you can use, definitely, saliva. Potatoes are easily available on liverboard, and there's lots of it for everyone. Masked defogs, baby shampoo, which most masked defogs are made of. I prefer to use a more concentrated amount of baby shampoo than the watered down defog. And again, I like to rub that on, let it half dry, and then wash it off when I get in the water to shoot the splits. Those tend to work for me. I know quite a lot of photographers like using the weakest of the Novus polishes. I think it's the blue one. I think Novus 3 always, but the blue Novus, that can also help just really smooth the surface off, particularly on acrylic domes. And I think people definitely feel that when that surface is really well buffed, it also resists droplets very nicely. And then about 15 years ago now, there's a guy, I think he was a chemist or something, who was an underwater photographer in Asia. He actually created like a split level solution, which worked brilliantly, and it really worked. And it was like, I think it was a 3-course treatment for dome ports, where you kind of did a cleaning, which was probably quite similar to Novus 3, and then you put this treatment on your dome port, and you left it on overnight or something, and then you had this final coat that took off the treatment and left the dome port. And his treatment definitely worked, and worked for longer than things like potato starch or baby shampoo, which generally only lasts for kind of half an hour, 20 minutes or so of the dive, and then after that it's kind of all gone, and depending on how many times you get it wet, of course. But that's often enough for a shoot. But that Asian product was around, but it never really took off in underwater photography, because people at the time were just like, couldn't be bothered to go through all that process. But I think now that people are a little bit more discerning, and back 15 years ago, kind of getting a good split level was kind of seen as an achievement, whereas now people want that perfection. I bet that product would actually probably do quite well now, and I don't remember what it was called. Maybe someone who can remember can write it in the comments. And if it's still on sale and it's passed me by, it would be great that people could write that in the comments. And I guess if anyone has got their own magic dome port droplet solution, add that in. I know people have used polishes like Lemon Pledge and things like that in the past. I've never tried that one myself. Rain-X, which obviously you use on motorcyclists, use it on their plastic visors. You can also use Rain-X in your car windscreen washer fluid as well to help keep water off. Rain-X definitely does work as well. And I know that in the past people have said don't use Rain-X on acrylic domes, but motorcyclists use it on their acrylic visors. So I'm not sure why people are worried about using it on dome ports. Obviously, a replacement visor is cheaper than a replacement dome port. But I've used Rain-X quite a lot. I tend to find the problem with Rain-X is you have to remember to pack it before the trip. So but you can buy it as wipes. So that's quite a good way, and then you can just keep them in your spares bag. It doesn't take up a lot of weight, and then you can use a Rain-X wipe before a dome port trip. I might try and remember to take some Rain-X with me to the Red Sea and see in a few weeks and see what difference it makes when shooting splits. But yeah, that for me is the best way to deal with droplets, and I think that's a pretty decent overview of all the sort of tips I can think of for split. Oh, one other magic trick tip for you when shooting split levels: if you use a 45-degree viewfinder, what you'll find with your 45-degree viewfinder is that it's got a rubber eye cap on the top, and as you lift that out the water, the rubber eye cap just on a 45-degree viewfinder will trap water inside it and stop you seeing through the viewfinder. So when shooting split levels, what you need to do is you need to get that rubber eye cap, squeeze it so it bulges out on one side, and flick it off, and leave it on the boat while you go in and do split levels, and then you won't get water pooling on top of your viewfinder to look through. Although I have to say, with a lot of people with mirrorless cameras actually prefer using the LCD screen.
Yeah.
Another thing that isn't very common in underwater photography, but is very useful, is that Subel, for example, they used to put a line across the back of their housing at the midpoint of the lens opening at the front, so that when you're behind the housing and you want to shoot split levels, you can use that line as a gauge for having your camera completely in the middle of the water. Or if you want it higher than that or lower than that, you know what you're doing. And that can be quite a useful thing to do. You don't need the housing manufacturers do it. If you've got like name labels, you can just put 2 name labels on the side of your housing at the midpoint, and it just gives you a visual reference for when the housing is exactly on that midpoint in the water. So yeah, the tips are just coming out of me today.
I'm sure we could do a whole a whole another hour on this. But that seems like a pretty good place to wrap up. If anybody has any more edible food products that you think are useful for underwater photography, please leave them in the comments below as well. And other than that, we will see you guys in the next one.